We're going to get started. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the SEBS Virtual Science Cafe, Restoring Nature in the Concrete Jungle, with Dr. Myla Aronson, professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources. She's also the director of the Hutchison Memorial Forest. My name is Brian McGonigal, manager of Alumni Community Engagement for SEBS and the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station. Just a couple of things before we get started. If you have questions, feel free to enter those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, not the chat. Please put them in the Q&A box, and they will be answered in order after Myla's presentation has concluded. We are also recording this video for subsequent posting and viewing, and that will be shared with everybody who has registered and or attended today's event. Okay, with that, I'm going to pass the ball over to Dr. Mary Nucci. She is the director of the Virtual Science Cafe program, and she's going to introduce our speaker for today. Go ahead, Mary.
Thank you, Brian, and welcome to all of you. Welcome to the first Science Cafe for spring of 2021, and I'm very honored to have Dr. Myla Aronson with us today. Myla has a master's and PhD in ecology, evolution, and natural resources, and has returned to us as a professor after a break from Rutgers. So I welcome you again, encourage you to ask questions. This is an opportunity to have a kind of informal education or informal interaction with professors. So Myla, thank you so much for being here, and I am going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me. Hi, everyone. I can't see you, but say hello, and I'm going to share my screen. So I want to talk a little bit about nature in the city and why it's important and why we want to, why we should restore it. So our world is rapidly urbanizing. This is a map of the world examining urban-caused habitat loss from 2000 to 2030. And we can see we're here, obviously, in the US, and we can see that we are one of the top urbanized and urbanizing countries in the world. We can go in a little bit more and see that we are not only are we in New Jersey are the most one of the most urbanized areas of the country, but we also continue to experience rapid habitat loss. Urbanization is one of the most prevalent forms of land use change, and the consequences of urbanization have global implications on biodiversity. And so it's important for us to understand those, and that's why I study them, not only because I live in New Jersey, one of the most urbanized states in the country, but also because it's important to understand nature, because nature is important for people as well as for biodiversity conservation. Cities are really interesting because they're novel ecosystems offering unique challenges for biodiversity and restoration. Cities, of course, are built for people, but they also support surprisingly large amounts of biodiversity of plants and animals. Cities we all know, are highly fragmented, disturbed environments. They are characterized across the world by a high density of built structures and impervious surfaces. And we see extinctions of native species and introductions of certain species, non-native species and invasive species across the world due to humans moving around. We're a globalized society. We move ourselves around, not as much right now, but we move ourselves around. And as well as at the same time, we're moving animals, insects, plants, and other animals around with us. Why should we care about nature? We care about nature because we like it, right? It's pretty. A lot of our recreation is goes around nature. We've discovered a lot of people discover nature is a lot more important now that we're locked down in our homes. And so we spend a lot more time in our parks, city parks, our yards, our gardens. But also nature is important because it offers, there are ecosystem services or benefits that nature offers to people, such as temperature control. Cities tend to be hotter than the surrounding landscapes, and having more trees, for example, cools the city. Air pollution control, plants are important for air pollution control, as well as for nature and natural areas and parks are important for regulating flooding, water pollution, as well as nature is really important for people's physical and mental health, our resilience to climate change, and it's the human experience. And what I mean by that is that 55% of the world's human population lives in cities, as suburbs and cities, I'm counting suburbs into this, as well as 83% of the US population. So urban is now a human experience. And so the nature that humans are experiencing is an urban nature. But not all is lost, because cities can actually be very important for biodiversity conservation. I'm going to talk about that throughout this study. Let's talk. So our city's really concrete jungle. So we go into New York City, we go into Times Square, and we think, oh, there's hardly any plants and animals here, right? And certainly some parts of the city, we might only see pigeons and rats and the occasional weed. But back in 2014, I did a study with several colleagues in which we looked at the birds and plants of the world's cities. And so we basically put together a lot of data that had been collected for different cities across the world. And so this is a map of the cities that we collected data for. And we put all that data together and we asked, what is the status of biodiversity in cities? And this was one of the first studies to look at this. And so it was an important study to show people that we really do support a lot of nature in our cities, even though they're built for people. And so I apologize for all the text in the slide, but the take-home point were that those cities, and that wasn't all the cities in the world, those were just a collection of cities that plants and animals have been collected for. They supported 20% of the world's birds and 5% of the world's plant species. Now, this is unique, this is really important because urban areas only cover about 3% of the Earth's terrestrial surface, but 20%, at least 20%, probably more as we add more cities, of the world's bird species. We found that these species, these birds and these plant species, are primarily native to the area in which they came, to the city in which they're found. So native meaning that they've been in this particular landscape for a very long time. They have evolved within that landscape over time. Versus introduced species are those species we've introduced either through intentional like horticultural plantings, or releasing bird species on new continents because we like them, or for hunting, or accidentally, like the emerald ash borer is an insect that was introduced accidentally on shipping pallets. We found that there are a few species that are cosmopolitan. So most of the species found in cities are unique to those cities and the surrounding landscape that city sits in. But we also found that cities are diverse and that there are few unique species or cosmopolitan species that we find across most cities across the world. So who are these city slickers? Well, for plants, these are the top plants. Of the top 11 plants found in 90% or more of the cities we studied. And you may not recognize the scientific names of these, but most of these are what we would consider as our weeds, right? So they grow in street cracks or in our gardens or in they're also important. Some of them are important agricultural weeds that grow outside of cities, but these are these plants are found on every continent, in cities on every continent. Of course, not Antarctica, because there's no cities in Antarctica yet. But these are our weeds, right? These are what we would consider to be weeds. We could go outside right now, even, well, maybe not with 2 feet of snow, but we could go outside and find these in a relatively short period of time anywhere we are in the world. What about the birds? Our city slickers birds, probably no big surprise. We recognize most of these birds. Even I, I'm not much of a birder, I can recognize these guys, right? These are those that are found on all continents, except Antarctica, in cities. And so these are the birds that characterize our cities. Although, like I said, cities are very diverse. So we're gonna go from city to city. We may see these across different continents, but we're also gonna see a lot of birds that are part of that native landscape. So where can we find this? Where do we find nature? Well, primarily we find nature in what we've called urban green spaces. These are natural or semi-natural areas, or even artificial ecological systems, like a green roof is an artificial ecological system, that are within the city. And they range from remnant patches of natural forest, for example, to people's home gardens and roofs. Understanding how these green spaces support biodiversity is important, because then it allows us to design and build cities that support both humans and nature. So why focus on green spaces? Well, they have, of course, ecological importances, right? They support assemblages of plants and animals, including, in some cities, rare and endangered species. They support environmental functions for such as flooding retention, temperature control, some of those ecosystem services that I talked about earlier. But they also have really important social importance too, and social functions too, and that they shape the character of the city and its neighborhood, provide a sense of place for people, and provide a range of physical, social, and physiological health benefits. There's a lot of studies that are going on, and newspaper articles and internet articles about nature bathing or forest bathing, or going out into nature for, I think it's at least 20 minutes, and it makes you feel better. It drops cortisone levels. They've found that people's heart rate goes down. So our experience of nature is important. So I want to talk quickly about a little case study that we did, thinking about the importance of green spaces, how cities can conserve biodiversity and be places where conservation can be focused upon, not just in our wildlands outside of urban areas like Yosemite or Yellowstone, but also in these green spaces. But they need some restoration. They need some ecological restoration. And so we performed a study where we looked at the restoration of some of these urban green spaces. And we had three main functions for these. One was to promote ecological connections among the urban and natural areas of the city. So that is connecting the natural areas like salt marshes to the upland areas that they would normally be connected in. Study the success of native plant species in urban soils. Urban soils they're not natural soils. Most of the time, they tend to be made of fill. So areas that have been dug up for the foundations of buildings, and then all the dirt and soil, and that's then moved to a new place and filled in. And so they tend not to be a natural soil. And also also how we can promote community engagement and stewardship in these urban green spaces. So this is a case study of the Jamaica Bay wildlife area. And this study was done in collaboration with some of my favorite people to work with, Dr. Stephen Hendel and Dr. Christina Countsinger. And we picked several parks around New York City to restore, several areas to restore. This area alone in Jamaica Bay houses 3 million people. So it's a highly urban area. So we can look in a little bit more and we can see these are the areas that we set up our restoration plots. We had 3 main areas: Eastern Queens near JFK Airport, Southeastern Brooklyn, and then Floyd Bennett Field, which is part of the Gateway National Recreation Area. And we set up these restoration plots. Like I said, we were interested in how we can utilize native plants. Will native plants be successful in these soils? How we can utilize native plants for connecting these natural areas of Jamaica Bay, all of these natural areas, to the rest of the city. So we set up these experiment and we designed the experiment in a way with a landscape architect in a way that as people walk through them, they would experience the native plants. And we chose these plant species based on their local nativity. So they were found in what Jamaica Bay wouldn't be without urbanization, which is maritime grasslands, shrublands, and maritime forests. And we also chose them based on their aesthetic qualities, right? They're pretty. People would think they were pretty, to encourage the use of these plant species instead in people's yards and gardens instead of traditional garden exotic species. We also chose plants that had resources, that gave resources to other animals, so birds and butterflies, bees, so that these areas could act as a center for diversity. And so here, this is a close-up of the design in which we had our different plants. And these are some of the plants that we planted. So we chose plants like beach plum because it has these are important food resources for birds. American holly, also they like the birds like the berries, but as well as pretty plants, right? So this is New York Aster, which is very pretty, and it's bee pollinated, as well as some grasses that can we could imagine planting in our garden. So how we were thinking about promoting ecological connections in the landscape was, will people use these plants if they see them, these native plants, and they're offered in our local nurseries, would people use them in their gardens? And if they do use these in their gardens, they are going to connect. So a bird might go from a beach plum in somebody's yard in the middle of Queens, and then carry that beach plum and disperse it out onto one of the natural areas in Jamaica Bay, or fly to Jamaica Bay and poop out the seeds. That's how birds disperse, right? And so our first question was, will native plants survive in these urban soils? So these are four different sites in which we can, I like to show this because it shows how different the soils were. So this is the top picture is a site, this is us planting and setting up our field crews setting up the sites, in which it was a very organic soil, so a very rich soil. In fact, during Hurricane Sandy, they had several trees fell down in this park, and they chopped them up and laid all of the mulch along in this little swale here. And we used parts of these parks that weren't used by people, right? So these were areas that were kind of just left alone and mowed. So we have all of these lawn mowed areas across cities, across our suburban areas, and they're really ecological deserts because turf grass does not support biodiversity. So I was really interested in how can we add diversity to these parks that are used by people, right? Parks in cities have to be ballparks, they have to have playgrounds, they have to have nature trails in some cases, sidewalks. And so they're heavily used by people, but also we have some areas that aren't used, and can we increase the diversity of these areas? And so we see here we have very different soils. So this site has this organic soil I was talking about. This area, which is over in Queens by the Home Depot and JCPenney, this has a very sandy, compacted soil. This is, you can't see, but it's kind of in between these two sites, and this is the side of a cricket pitch. And so the first question was, will native plants survive? And like I said, we picked native plants that were native to the area, but we weren't sure if they would do well in these really urban soils, these soils that aren't natural. So I'm going to give one example here, and this is an example of bayberry, how much northern bayberry grew over a couple of years after it was planted. And so the picture to the left is one of our research sites with the sandy soil, and this bigger shrub in the background is where my mouse is, that's northern bayberry. And what we found, not surprisingly, but what we found is that bayberry does better in soils with more sand. And so what this graph is showing is the cover of bayberry after 2 years, so how much its leaf area was covering over so that's a nice way to measure growth, to the percent sand in the soil. So across the bottom, or the x-axis, is the percent sand in the soil. And we found increasing growth or increased cover with greater percent sand. Now, this may bayberry even though we think that every plant should do well in organic soil, right? But we found that bayberry did better with increasing oh, I'm freezing, sorry. I did not get this, sorry. We found that bayberry had increasing cover, increasing growth. We also asked people, what do you think of these plants, right? So we did a survey because we were, again, interested in, will people grow these? Can we utilize these plants as ecological connections to the rest of the city? And so we went to each of the parks and we asked, I think it was every third person that came by, and we asked them if they would participate in a survey. And we showed them, at this point, was the same year we planted. So the plants didn't look all that pretty yet. They hadn't really grown in. We were planting little baby plants at first. And so we showed them pictures of our plants and asked them, do you like these? And so we had 3 kind of categories that they're very attractive, rate the plants, very attractive, somewhat attractive, not at all attractive. And so there were some interesting trends in that one of the plants that people really didn't like was northern bayberry. And I don't know why. I think maybe it looks a little messy, right? So people did not like northern bayberry, which is interesting because northern bayberry is actually a native plant that is used for hedges. It's a really nice plant because you can clip it into hedgerows and things and areas and cities, and it does pretty well, again, in sandy soils. What did they like? What do people like? They like attractive, showy flowers. New York Aster was by far rated the best, the most attractive plant. And you can see why. It's got pretty flowers. You can imagine growing it in your yard or your garden. We then asked, okay, if these plants were available, so almost none of these are available at the Home Depot in Jamaica Bay or the Lowe's in East Brunswick. But if they were available, would city dwellers, would people buy them and plant them in their yard? The ones they like, that is, right? And by far, most people said yes. So over 50% of people said absolutely they would buy these plants if they were available. You know, a little less than 25% have no yard, right? They live in high-rise apartment buildings. Only a few said no, and a few said maybe, they just didn't want to commit. But one of the arguments of not planting native plants, one of the most common arguments that I've heard is that they're not available, but that people won't buy them. That's one of the, but people don't buy, what our study is showing is that people don't buy them because they're not available, but that people would buy native plants for their yards if they were available in our commercial nurseries. Now, yes, these are all available in native plant nurseries, but they're not available at Home Depot and they're not available at Lowe's. And so we need these plants, we need an increase in native plants in our commercial nurseries. We also asked people to give descriptors of why they liked particular plants. And so this is a word cloud of what did they like about the plants. And these are some of the most common, these are some of the plants that they liked, the pictures. And it was just, this was interesting to look at. What do people, by far, people really like flowers, right? That's the biggest word in here, colorful, that they were pretty. So people are really attracted to flowering flowers, right? Flowering plants. There was some interesting, people really talked about their children, their sons, their daughters, that they would like these plants, or they wanted to see these for their son and daughters. And then they also focused on color. So purple, yellow, red, they liked color, people like color. And what did they not like? So here's some plants that people didn't like, the people of the study did not like. And again, color is a big one. I think they did not like the color of the plant. So maybe white tends not to be as much of a color. White flower is not much of a color that people like. That one large response was that people were afraid that the plants would attract mosquitoes, that they look messy, right? And they are weeds. They considered a lot of these weeds, and that they would attract mosquitoes, but these plants don't attract mosquitoes. Mosquitoes survive, most mosquitoes in cities survive in standing water, and these aren't, you know, like our tires or even little cups of water or cans on the side of the road. My favorite response was very Brooklyn, is meh. It just, nobody felt anything for them. It just weren't very nice. So knowing this quick and dirty overview that I just gave you of biodiversity in a city. Cities are more biodiverse than we assume they are and thought they were. We can restore ecological connections, and native plants will survive in urban areas. And there is a demand for native plants in gardening. How do we build biodiversity in our cities? So cities are already built, right? And I want to end on this. Cities are already built, but we know nature is important. So how do we build more nature into our cities? If cities are already built, particularly in the north, developed countries and Northern Hemisphere. So how do we build nature into our existing cities? Because we can do better. We know that cities are supporting biodiversity, but they're certainly not supporting as much biodiversity as surrounding natural areas. And how do we increase that biodiversity? Can we? And how do we do it? So what are the implications? And this is what I really like about my research, is not just asking the ecological questions and the science that excites me, it's the applications of this. So how I can then use my knowledge to inform city parks departments and planning departments, and how we can add biodiversity to our landscapes. And so this was a report that I participated in, that listed 7 important factors that to build biodiversity in cities. One is the patch size, that we need larger patches. So larger patches of parks parks, natural area, larger green spaces will support more species. Matrix quality. So this is getting at adding ecological connections. So planting our native plants in our yards that support movement and connectivity between green spaces. So in the urban matrix, or all the urban areas surrounding our parks and gardens, we can add in native plants that would help butterflies and birds move within the urban landscape. Habitat habitat diversity. So building more diverse, increasing the number of habitats. So we don't just want to have forest area, although that's pretty important in our forested cities, but we want to have wetlands, we want to have grasslands, we want to build a diverse habitats so that we can support more species. Special resources are another one. These are large trees. It's large trees, water bodies, any special resources, streams and rivers that act as connections, but also support biodiversity. Connections, I skipped ahead. Connections are features in the urban landscape that facilitate the movement of plants and animals. They can include thin stretches of green space. So roadside, the medians in between highways, those can we can vegetate those naturally, and they can be important for connecting patches together. Native plant vegetation, I talked a lot about native plants throughout this talk. And then management, or human activities and planning that promote biodiversity outcomes. So let's see how this might work in a hypothetical landscape. So in developing, this report was done to help cities develop urban biodiversity plans. And so we can start with identifying existing resources. This on the left side, over here on the left side of the screen, such as large parks and regional corridors. So this long regional corridors might represent a riparian area, or the forest around a river system. And then building upon these resources, improving them, expanding them out like this. So we can build upon those existing resources, add connections, increase the quality of the matrix. And these can be achieved through a combination of land acquisition and biodiversity friendly management, including increasing our plants and the native plants in the landscape. And so this provides a toolkit for the types of opportunities that can be developed. And this is actually being utilized in Silicon Valley and in cities in Silicon Valley, and tested out if this can actually increase biodiversity. We expect that it will, and it will, but how much it will. And so at that, I'd like to stop and take any questions. I put my email here in case you want to email me, and I'll take questions.
Thank you, Myla. We do have some questions. So since we viewers today have the greatest impact on our own properties, what are some of the best ways we can encourage and support biodiversity in our own yards?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say focus on building habitat structure. So we've lost a lot. For example, we've lost a lot of our bird diversity, and one of the reasons for that is because we have lawns and tall trees. We don't have a lot in between. We don't have a lot of shrub layer. We don't have a lot of small trees underneath our large trees. And so increasing that, what we call habitat vertical heterogeneity, or vertical structure, and as well as planting native plants. So there are a lot of native plants that can provide the same beauty and the same as non-native, as some of our favorite non-natives. So planting winged sumac instead of burning bush. Winged sumac has bright, it looks very similar to burning bush, but it's a native plant. It also produces berries that birds love to eat.
Okay, thank you. So another person asked, I'm interested in your thoughts on how we should think about restoring nature in light of the dynamic quality of the environment. Climate change is altering temperatures, precipitation patterns, and atmospheric gas concentrations. Species populations are naturally dynamic, etc. So if stationarity is dead, looking at the past isn't necessarily a model.
Okay. Oh, I agree. And this restoration study that we did, one of our purposes was, and I didn't get into it for time, but one of the purposes of the study was also why do we want to plant, not only just increase diversity of these parks, but we're going to lose some of that area due to sea level rise. So will plants that would grow at a lower elevation, will they grow up or into? So there's no into the urban landscape. And so a lot of our common plants have large ranges. So most of those large ranges, in terms of they will do okay with climate change. But I would advise that we increase genetic diversity through restoration. So by introducing southern genotypes along the southern ranges, southern part of the ranges of these species, so that when our climate is more like South Carolina in not too distant future, that we have genotypes that are still going to survive in our cities. The other thing about cities is that they're hotter, right, than the surrounding area. So they are almost living laboratories of climate change. And so if we find that particular plants are doing really well, we may in particular native plants some do really well in cities, and so they may be the ones that will continue to do well.
Okay, thank you. If you are planting species that people really like, are they more likely to dig them up and take them home?
Yeah. So, yeah, yes, they are. But so that's why in any restoration, whether it be in a city or in non-city, involving the community is really important. So and one of the parks, we had, these parks were also chosen because some of them had community groups that we worked with, and some of them didn't. And so we were interested in this kind of dynamic. Do the restorations succeed better if there's community groups involved? And in one of the parks, it depends on if we involve the community early on. And one of the parks, in the Springfield Park, they have a Friends of Springfield Park, but also it's a very tight-knit community. And we knew this because whenever we were out, people would come and talk to us. And particular, Mr. Richards, who was an older gentleman who told us that he would look after our site to make sure the teenagers didn't get to it. He would spread the word. And whenever he came out to talk to us, the teenagers would come by and, "Hi, Mr. Richards, hi, how are you?" Like, everybody said hello, all of the kids, all of the adults, everyone respected. So having either a community group or a local champion or both working with who's in charge. And it's not the parks, in these city parks, it's not the park managers who are really in charge. It's the park, it's the local champions or the leaders of the community, like Mr. Richards at Springfield Park, and the community groups that take care of the park itself. And then you have less vandalism. So we had a lot less vandalism than we thought we would at that particular park. And because Mr. Richards passed the word that it was not to be messed with.
That's good to see. How does bayberry sustain improved growth as sand content in the soil increases? What other soil factors are significant in bayberry growth?
We looked at some of the other factors that might be important. Bayberry isn't going to do great if it's like 100% sand, right? And there's no organic matter and no mycorrhizae or organisms to support it. But, and I don't know the second part of your question. I can't remember what else we found was important for bayberry growth. But it's to a certain percentage of sand that it does better. Why? I mean, there could be a lot of reasons why. Maybe it can't deal with a lot of water. So it could be that the more organic sites, that mulchy site that had this thick organic layer, it was very wet. And some species can't deal with that and can't grow with that.
Okay. Are you considering doing experiments like your New York City one in our cities where Rutgers is located? On the Camden campus, there's an urban garden behind the community engagement building that was due to be expanded before the pandemic closed everything. Promoting more urban gardens in our RU community seems like a great place to start.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I would love that. The reason we did this at Jamaica Bay is because we had funding from Gateway National Recreation Area to do this there. And so I would love to do something like that here in New Brunswick or in Camden or Newark even. And it really does come down to funding. Plants aren't cheap and people aren't cheap, right? We need support for students, primarily support for the plants and for students to do the work and perform the research. And so it's not only we're answering research questions with this work, but we're educating students and the community.
Right.
One of the things I like best about working in cities and doing these restoration experiments in cities is people come and talk to us. And that's awesome. I mean, I spent a lot of my time actually not planting and not measuring plants, but talking to the community, to local members of the community who come by and want to know what we're doing. The most common question, not in Jamaica Bay, but at another site that I had was, are you planting tomatoes? And so I said, no, but this is what I'm doing. So.
Okay. You stated that cities only cover 2 to 3% of the world's surface. They apologize if they're misquoting you, but it's a small percentage. But 20% of the bird species can be found there. They would like to know what percent of bird species would be found in the areas now cities if cities were not there. Just unclear what the net effect of urbanization is.
Oh, I'm trying to remember the numbers. We did look at this in that same study, and we estimated based on surrounding what's found in the surrounding natural areas and diversity of non-urban areas. I can't remember what we estimated. I know that we estimated for plants, we found that cities support about 25% we find about 25% of species that you would, it's a reduction of 75% for plants. For birds, it was much less than that. And I just can't remember the numbers.
Okay, next question. Given the specificity of many species, is there a community of research that can provide guidance on what to plant to provide the connections and appropriate habitat for the species in need?
There are some resources. Brooklyn Botanic Garden it came out maybe over 10 years, 15 years ago or so, a book on native alternatives. And that's a really good resource. They're for this particular area. Depends on where you are. Depends on where you are in the country or in the world. In other parts of the country, there are some extension programs that we don't have that, but we have an extension program, but we don't have this particular program that where you can talk to find information about what are some native alternatives. But that's something that's really needed, particularly in our urban area, and our suburban and urban in our area,
right,
of New Jersey.
Another question, can you discuss any recent success stories of urban restoration in New Jersey? And where can we find a list of recommendations for native plants to plant in yards and parks in New Jersey?
So I can't think of anything off like restoration. There are a lot of successful restorations. And in fact, New Jersey, we have a lot of urban wetland restorations. One of my favorites is in the Meadowlands. There are several. There's been a lot of work done on restoring landscapes, restoring salt marshes. And there's one that's part of Mill Creek Park near the Secaucus High School, and it has a beautiful boardwalk. And in fact, I think my cover picture is that site. And so that's one of a really good example. List of native plants. So Mary just put up Master Gardener. I mentioned the book, Brooklyn Botanic Gardens book. There are some of our nurseries. So Pinelands Nursery is a really good resource for native plants. They actually have lists of what will do well in a dry shade environment, dry shade yard, or what will do well in a sunny wet spot or sunny dry spot. So they have these lists of species that will do well in those areas. And then they also have information about the plants, pictures and things like that. There's also Toad Hill Nursery, which is also a really nice one, and Donaldson's Nursery. And then the New Jersey Native Plant Society. Awesome.
Okay. Incorporating biodiversity into the suburbs is crucial towards reaching a more sustainable landscape. However, I find that especially from working in the nursery trade, it is hard to get people to care about including natives and diversifying their gardens. What do you think is the best way to get people to really care to implement change?
How to care. Talks like this, outreach, discussing this with people. Okay, hey, this is a here, this is what everybody else has, or this is what is recommended, but why don't we put in, these are some of the natives that you could put here. So I had a landscape architect come out and to my yard and redo my walkway, and he wanted to plant vinca all over, and I said no. And I think a lot of this is that we don't have, except for at Rutgers, I'm going to say, is training for landscape professionals of the importance of native plants. And actually, we have a great landscape architect program, and we're doing that. And the students are many of them take my plant ecology course. Many of them incorporate natives into their designs, and what are some alternatives that you can use for some of the common non-natives that everybody, boxwoods, what's an alternative to boxwood, or what's an alternative to vincum, and so on. What was the second part?
Second.
Or what was the rest of that? I don't know if I answered it all the way, but.
It was just, how do you think would be the best way to get people
homeowners.
Yeah.
Yeah, homeowners, I think a lot of that is just education and outreach, and parks. So one of the things I think a lot of our parks do well, and our county and city parks could do better with funding, of course, it all depends on funding, is promoting native plants in the parks.
Okay. Another question, as a way to increase species diversity in our communities, what do you think about promoting ethnic nationalities from different world regions to bring natural plants/animals from their communities into the US? What may be the pros and cons of this approach?
So plants are, I mean, not all plants are invasive, right? And there are a lot of really important food plants, and there are important plants that are brought in culturally, and that certainly should not be stopped. We should have a more control of or more of what plants we're bringing in. So if something is invasive in a similar climate to let's say New Jersey, then let's say there's a plant from that's introduced, we know it's invasive in Europe, and we want to bring it here, we probably should not bring that plant, whether it's culturally important or not. It's more likely to become invasive. So I'm not saying we shouldn't plant non-natives at all. I think we should mix our natives with our non-natives, but we need to be careful to stay away to not bring in, introduce, or plant or spread invasive plants. And New Jersey has a list of invasive plants. New York State actually has a really nice list of plants, and they've even banned some of the most invasive plants from being sold by nurseries. Yeah.
Okay. What are the best varieties of mid-sized native plants? Hold on one second. What are the best varieties of mid-sized native plants to structure a property to be friendly to this region?
Oh, mid-size. Let's see. Some of the sumacs are nice. Those are mid-size. Some of our hollies, like winterberry holly, Beautyberry is another plant that's a nice shrub. I think. Yeah, a lot of these are available on some of the lists we talked about too.
Okay.
I have winterberry holly in my yard, a lot of it. Dogwoods, some of the dogwoods are very nice. Not Florida dogwood is really hard to grow because it has the native dogwood because it gets attacked by a fungal disease. But some of the shrub dogwoods are really pretty, like the red osier dogwood, and that's really nice in the winter too because the stems turn bright red in the winter.
Okay. You mentioned that residents often express concern about mosquitoes. Are you working with local mosquito control programs so they may provide input, especially regarding landscaping that may lead to water pooling, such as ponds or runoff management?
No, I'm not. We do have a mosquito program here. Most of my work most of my research and kind of design and outreach work has been in upland, in soils that we're not gonna see a lot of mosquitoes actually.
Okay.
We don't have a lot of pooling, but.
Okay. I think we're just going to have time for one more question. So one person writes, do it yourself. Autonomous urban planning and architecture are proliferating across the globe. They include, but are not limited to, tactical urbanisms. What precedent comes to mind for you beyond seed bombing for organizing action structured in a bottom-up fashion? For instance, targeting non-spaces in the built environment, such as highway medians and jug handle covered leaf green spaces or power line strips to sow native nature.
Yeah, that's a good, I think working with community groups, especially the parks, friends of whatever, Springfield Park, friends of whatever park, and local community groups is really important. That allows for more restoration in some of these areas. Medians, roadsides, those are hard because they are, they're very strongly regulated by DOTs. In fact, we had wanted to do some of these restorations in New York on some of the medians, but we couldn't get the permission. I think, so working with community groups, oh, I had another idea and I lost it for a second. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I think that's about all the time we have for today's presentation. So if you have questions you'd like to ask Dr. Aronson, we're going to share her email address in a follow-up email. So feel free to reach out to Dr. Aronson with any further questions you might have. I'd like to thank Dr. Aronson for her time today.
Thanks.
And thank you all for joining us.